Hello, and welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show, a podcast to help you unlock tremendous growth for your app. My name is Shamant Rao. I'm the CEO of the boutique growth marketing firm Rocketship HQ and host of the podcast Mobile User Acquisition Show. In each episode, we feature experts in the field of mobile growth and discuss strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile growth marketing. By the end of each episode, you will have gained actionable and tactical insights that will help you make more informed decisions in your own work around growth. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is produced by Meryl Vincent, Content Marketing Manager at Rocketship HQ.
Our guest today is Ashley Black, founder at Candid Consulting. In today's episode, we will dive into the intricacies of Google UAC strategies on iOS after Apple's introduction of ATT. I love this episode because this is from an ex-Googler who gives us the inside track into the very many dynamics at play within Google that shaped a lot of changes post-ATT. Ashley describes details about Google's initial response to ATT and talks about modeled conversions. We uncover the challenges and limitations that Google faces with iOS inventory, especially the inability to prompt for ATT in browsers, and also the improvements brought about by Scan4, including web-to-app tracking. This episode has a ton of granular insight into how you can adapt to a post-ATT world on iOS with UAC, and I'm excited for this.
I'm very excited to welcome Ashley Black to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. And I'm excited to have you, Ashley, because you are going to talk about something that I think a lot of people just almost dismissively think of as a black box. And I think what's so interesting to learn from you, and certainly I did learn when we last spoke, was just understanding some of the nuts and bolts of what is very easy to dismiss as a black box, which is Google UAC. You've certainly seen it from the inside and the outside. So for all of those reasons, I'm excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to chat with you.
To kick us off, you've seen the UAC product from the inside and the outside. You worked at Google during and just after the introduction of ATT. And for those of us who were outside at the time, myself included, the impression I got was that there wasn't a lot of official guidance coming from Google immediately after ATT was out. What, according to what you saw, were some of the factors that were driving this dynamic?
You weren't alone. This was the feedback we got from everybody, and even internally, right? I led one of the sales teams at Google working with app developers, and I think they felt a lot of lack of support because there was very few comms on how Google was reacting to this, and therefore what their guidance was to the advertisers when iOS 14 rolled out. And so from my end, what I really comprehended on Google's strategy here is they have a very complex relationship with Apple, and maybe more so than the other networks. And so Google always is a little bit hesitant to be the first mover on anything because they're very cautious about their approach. They know that they have a target on their back and they get a lot of scrutiny anytime something goes wrong. And so I think they were just very, very hesitant. Now, keeping in mind, like Apple's instructions on SKAdNetwork and the rollout and everything, they were complex, and it took a lot of, I think, sort of deciphering and understanding what was the best way to implement some of the recommendations or the changes that they were enforcing. And so Google was just really hesitant to say definitively to advertisers, this is what we're going to do. They were more in the mindset of like, let's just sit back and sort of wait and observe to see. But I think to outsiders, that was viewed as, you don't know, or you're not helpful, because they were sitting quiet for a while.
Certainly, that makes a lot of sense. And for what it's worth, I think a lot of marketers are just waiting and watching to really gauge the impact of ATT to see if they should really ramp down their budgets, how it impacted their marketing. So I think the wait and watch makes sense, given a lot of marketers are doing that too. Post-ATT, one of the first communications from Google was about them using more modeled conversions. And I think that there was a bar graph filled post that I still recollect. After this was publicly announced as like, hey, here's how we're approaching conversions and conversion tracking. You were working with some of the largest advertisers on Google at the time. What did you see the response being to the modeled conversions? And how did that differ from based on the size of the advertisers you may have been talking to?
To put it simply, anybody who was big and spending a lot with Google and also spending a lot with other networks wasn't going to be using modeled conversions for their primary attribution. The smaller advertisers who maybe, let's just say, slightly less savvy, therefore like didn't really understand how to leverage SKAdNetwork and maybe weren't running across as many networks as, I mostly worked with mobile game companies. And so they tend to work, they could be running across 8, 10, 12 different networks, right? For some of the smaller guys, they might only be running with Google or maybe just running Google and Meta. And in that case, I think that they were fine to take the modeled conversion sort of at face value. And also keeping in mind, like with SKAdNetwork, most people at the time, and even to this day, had to use an MMP to get all of that data. And those can be costly. And so you did have this big disparity of the bigger advertisers and the ones that generated the most revenue for Google really not relying on modeled conversions. And then sort of the smaller guys, the long tail advertisers who were totally fine to accept it. The modeled conversions was tough because even internally, it was hard to be able to say definitively, hey, this is how they were modeled, right? Or these are the factors that went into it. And then just to see the level of disparity because of some of the SKAdNetwork, the shortcomings in how they measured things, and we'll talk about that later. And specifically to Google's network, the discrepancies were so massive. And also, it's worth calling out in both directions. I saw it where, of course, everybody assumed Google's number would be way more inflated than what SKAdNetwork. Sure, I saw that a lot. But there were, I'd say, roughly 10% of advertisers who saw more conversions on SKAdNetwork than they did on Google. And so for us as salespeople, I think it made it really challenging to be able to go to an advertiser and say, this is the source you should be using when we saw these like extreme differences.
Right. Why do you think there was a delta where SKAN was over-reporting versus Google?
Google, I will say this, that they hold themselves to a very high bar in terms of how they modeled out those conversions. And so they have to have a really high level of confidence in order to say, yes, this happened. So what we saw a lot of times is if an app was new, right, like brand new, hadn't spent with us, and Google didn't have any like historical data on it, a lot of times we would see SKAN over reporting versus on Google because it didn't have historical data to sort of model off of. Also, depending on where your traffic was coming from, like let's say YouTube, where they didn't have any opportunity to capture IDFAs because YouTube doesn't prompt for ATT. Again, you couldn't use that information to then inform the model. So people who were 90% spending on YouTube and maybe a new app, Google just didn't have the level of confidence to say, yes, this conversion happened, where with SKAN, that it didn't matter.
If I understand correctly, model conversions were based on some form of deterministic data, whatever was somewhat legally clear for Google to collect. Could have been IDFAs, but could also just have been first-party data or past historical data to say, now we have a reasonable amount of confidence that this conversion did happen.
Exactly.
And of course, if a lot of the traffic is YouTube, all of that deterministic data just goes away. Did I understand that correctly?
Absolutely, yes.
Can you speak to, yes, YouTube's one piece of it. What about the other parts of Google's inventory? Is there a lot of deterministic data available on those? How would you describe that?
The way that I always like to explain it for people is that there's 3 primary sources of traffic for Google on iOS. It's search, AdMob, and YouTube. That's it. In comparison to Android, where you have the Play Store, which is a huge percentage of the traffic. So you really only have those three. And the way that I break it down is which of those platforms has the ability to prompt for ATT. It kind of frustrated me when I was on the inside that there weren't more comms from, the MMPs or thought leaders or anything, because they seem to overlook the fact that Google's inventory is just different than so many of the other networks. I know we had talked about this before, where if you take Meta, for example, and I don't know what percentage exactly of their traffic comes from apps, but I have to imagine it's very, very high. TikTok is just an app. If you look at Snap, it's just an app. And then all of the other networks are mostly, their inventories on apps. Google's different. If what's Google known for? Search, right? Where do most people search? In a browser. You cannot prompt for ATT in a browser. And so initially, prior to Scan 4, which we can talk about separately, there was really no way to capture the ATT, the prompt, or do the prompt in a browser. So immediately, no opportunity for IDFAs on a big chunk of Google's inventory. Then you have YouTube, which is primarily app, but Google made the decision not to prompt for ATT in YouTube, in the app. And I think most people know, but if you don't, in order to collect the IDFA, you have to be able to get user consent in both the publishing app and in the downloaded app. And so even if somebody did consent in the downloaded app, they had no prompt to consent in YouTube. So no IDFAs there, no IDFAs on search, no IDFAs on YouTube. So that really leaves AdMob. And then it's just a function of whether publishers are prompting.
And I think that's a very important dynamic as compared to channels like Meta, like you pointed out, because Meta does have an audience network, but that's a far lower percentage of their inventory as compared to AdMob per se. And so I think that definitely makes so much sense. And you're right that that is not something a lot of people know or recognize or are clear about. Thank you for explaining that.
One of the things I was going to mention is up until, I know Scan 4 was released earlier or maybe mid-year in 2023, but Google didn't really adopt some of it until October. And so up until that point, until October of 2023, SKAdNetwork also wasn't reporting on web to app traffic. So again, you're going to go back that like Google search is all web. I mean, some people are going to say, oh, well, what about the Google search app? That's, it's nothing meaningful. And so you have all of this traffic, and I cannot tell you the number of times, especially with not so much with games. Games didn't tend to tap into like Google search inventory quite as much. But if you had like an e-commerce app or in some cases, fintech, or all of those other categories that relied heavily on search, up until October, they weren't seeing any of their search traffic counted in SKAdNetwork. And so if that's what the advertiser was using to look at performance, they would say, well, Google's awful. And it wasn't until that switch where we really started to see all of those conversions funnel through, and it started to make a meaningful difference in terms of how people did measurement.
So tell me about Scan 4 and how Scan 4 changed things on web.
To be fair, Google wasn't as impacted by some of the changes with iOS 14 and ATT, I think, like some of the other networks, namely Meta, who we saw, even in their earnings really be substantially impacted by the changes as a result of it. And so maybe that's why Google didn't get quite as much publicity on how their network was really different and how it was impacted by the changes that happened with ATT. But for Scan 4, what most people talked about was we're going to get multiple postbacks, and now we have fine grain and coarse grain. And that's what a lot of people focused on. And then sort of like buried deep in there in most of the comms that I read or any articles was, oh, and by the way, there's web to app tracking now. Well, that was huge. We celebrated that so much at Google. It was really meaningful. That was enormous for us. Again, a huge percentage of Google's traffic on iOS comes from search. And most of those searches are done in a browser on your mobile device. And so for the longest time, those weren't tracked. And SKAN4 changed that. Now, keeping in mind, and you can only track those conversions from web to app in Safari. And that is by and large the largest browser on iOS devices. But if you're somebody like me who uses Chrome as my primary browser on my iPhone, my conversions still would not be tracked in SKAdNetwork. There's just like these really like fine details, I think, that people don't always realize about how Google is impacted or different than the other networks.
Right. And as you pointed out, web to app, I think it was an afterthought for the vast majority of people. I think one of the reasons was just because it was Safari only. And I certainly remember telling folks, oh, it's Safari only. But you're right that on iOS, Safari is significant. If you were getting zero attribution in the past, anything non-zero is a big win, right? And that's pretty much what I imagine happened. And would it be fair to say that was what contributed to there being just better visibility on Google and thereby performance on Google post SKAN4?
I would hope so. I was only at Google for a few more months after that release, but I did see several advertisers, especially the ones who were serving like 99% of their traffic on search, really after that change, because every time we would go into conversations with them, we'd have to remind them, don't forget that all of your traffic is missing in SKAN because of this. Because it's not like they're looking, in most cases, they're separating out what network they're delivering to. They're just looking at their app campaign holistically. So the fact, like, it wasn't being called out that they were only being served on search. And so anyway, I did start to see a lot of folks after that change come back and say, oh, okay, wow, we need to reevaluate how we're investing here, because now that Google's capturing these conversions, the playing field is a little bit leveled and we need to allocate dollars accordingly.
Certainly. Another piece of the puzzle really tends to be Firebase. I've heard it being said somewhat anecdotally and by Google teams as well that presence of Firebase correlates with stronger performance. So what have you seen in terms of the impact of Firebase on performance? And how did this differ from Android versus iOS?
On Android, I think there's no contesting it, that by bidding on Firebase events and having Firebase, you will see a performance improvement. So I have no qualms about saying that to anybody or recommending that they make that switch. On iOS, that's not necessarily the case. To be honest, in terms of performance, it's not going to really see any significant uplift, but there's no harm in having it. So at that point, I sort of view it as like a developer's choice on iOS. The performance isn't improved all that much as some of the data that Firebase is able to gain and therefore improve performance on the campaigns has to do with device IDs, which obviously they still have on Android, but per our conversation up to this point does not have on iOS. And so that's really why you don't see the same level of performance boost with Firebase on iOS. However, I think this speaks for Android products that Google rolls out and iOS. Firebase will sort of be the gatekeeper for any of those new features and products. So if you want to get into it, one of them is like the on-device measurement, on-device conversion measurement that Google has on iOS. Sure. That is only available through Firebase. And so I think as you start to see more of Google's products roll out on either OS, Firebase is going to be a requirement in order to implement them. So at some point, it probably makes sense to add it in.
Sure. What's on-device measurement?
On-device measurement is Google's way of, it's for apps that collect either email addresses or phone numbers, right? You do have to have one of those user identifiers or personal PII. And it's their way of being able to map those users with some sort of action that happened on Google's network in a like Apple privacy compliant way. And so all of the measurement and connection happens on the device. It stays on the device. It doesn't leave. Right. And they're able to say, okay, do we think that something happened here? And then they're able to then model out
Sure.
with greater accuracy those conversions.
So if I understand correctly, it's on device, it's aggregate, or maybe it's not aggregate, right? Because it's individualized, but it's on device, and therefore it's privacy safe. And therefore
Yeah.
it's used to inform the modeling of the model conversions in some way.
We have seen it's not huge increase in performance, but there has been several case studies that Google has released of being able to show that when advertisers have the ability to run
Sure.
ODM and opt to, that they do see a modest increase in performance.
Sure. To switch gears a little bit, I know we talked a bit about the different kinds of inventory on Google versus other channels. I think what's also interesting from what we talked about earlier was the inventory on iOS tends to be very different from Android. Can you talk to us about that and also talk about how that can impact user acquisition strategy?
Yeah, I mentioned this in an article that I wrote on sort of helping people navigate their iOS campaigns with Google. But if you're not running video in a substantial way, then you are really limiting the amount of traffic and inventory coverage that you have on iOS. So again, going back to it, kind of like if you could see my hands here, but if we look at Android, there's a lot more traffic or a lot more inventory sources that Google can tap into. You have search, you have AdMob, you have YouTube, but then you also have Play. And that's the big differentiator there. Play is incredibly meaningful in terms of the Android inventory that's available. On iOS, you basically have all of those minus Play. So you have search, AdMob, and YouTube. Well, it's the amount of inventory that can be captured that's video on iOS is a lot more substantial than you would see on Android. So I think on Android, maybe you still need to focus on video, but you have more opportunity for image assets for coverage and text assets. Again, thinking about what you see in the Play Store. On Android, you have AdMob and YouTube, and those are predominantly video. The other thing that I like to call out is like there's a lot of differences. Like I don't even know how many different types of video placements there are on YouTube. But if you're just thinking about it, like you've got bumper ads, which are 6-second videos. You have skippable and non-skippable videos on YouTube. You can do, if you're familiar with it, when you're watching YouTube or something, sometimes you get 2 back-to-back ads. Well, those tend to be a little bit shorter. Maybe they want them to be like 10 to 15 seconds. And if they're only getting 1 at a time, maybe that's a 30-second skippable ad. And so there's all these different variations. And then AdMob's a whole other slew of types of formats and like portrait versus landscape, et cetera. And so in short, it's just critical to have a super strong video strategy if you're going to be running iOS campaigns with Google.
Again, that's not something that's obvious to a lot of people. I think a lot of folks just think, okay, Android is kind of similar to iOS, just different devices. But you're so right that there's just a day and night difference in the kinds of inventory you can expect. And that makes so much sense.
One other quick note on that. I see a lot of people just copying and pasting what they have over on another network, let's say Meta, and then just saying, okay, I'm just going to put it over here on Google. And the quality of the inventory is different too. So I see a lot of people using UGC or like TikTok style videos. Google does have a placement for those, right? They have YouTube Shorts, which is kind of the equivalent. So there's that opportunity. But to only have that one style of content, which may work really, really well on TikTok and may work really, really well on Meta. But on Google, again, you're having to remember that like, if I'm about to watch I don't know, like let's say like a clip from SNL as an example. And that's going to just be a YouTube video. It's not in the shorts. You know, I'm not scrolling. I'm going in and I'm choosing to select and watch that video. To see UGC content in that format might be, it doesn't necessarily fit. And so in that case, you might need sort of higher production quality videos for the YouTube inventory that you don't necessarily need to do on the other platforms.
And that's such a great point because, again, oftentimes with black box algorithms, it's easy to just forget about, hey, what's underneath, what some of the pieces are that we can actually see and understand and contextualize, right? And you're right that there's shorts, but there's also just very different formats, even within YouTube. And I think the same is true even on Meta, which is that if you have an ad for Reels, that same ad may not perform anywhere as well on Insta feeds or Facebook feed. And I think it's just so important to keep that context in mind, even if the algorithm is ostensibly a black box.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
Ashley, this has been incredibly instructive. And as I said at the outset, I love and appreciate the way you really deconstructed what's seen as a monolithic black box and just really unpacked some of the things that are very controllable, and also just to understand what's behind the workings of that. This has been great. This is perhaps a good place for us to wrap up. But before we do that, can you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
I run an app consultancy and media agency called Candid Consulting. So you can find me at candidconsultinggroup.com. And feel free to reach out to me. I love to chat through the types of issues that you're having, or if you just want to get more information, or if you're interested in offloading some things over to my team, that's what we help with. And so that's where you can find me.
Wonderful. And we will link to that in the show notes. For now, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.